My name is Edgar, and this is Kalam, a podcast about the Middle East.
In the world where we live, in the global war on terror era where we live, the principle of proportionality is used to portray any civilian loss as proportionate, as incidental, as collateral damage. These are all synonymous. In another world where the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, for example, is more powerful, civilian protection in interpretation will have more weight. So today, in the moment where we live, where you have liberal leaders or not so liberal in Western countries, and their potential replacement would be people like Trump and Milei and these crazy leaders. In this very extremely difficult moment where we live, it is possible to interpret under international law tens of thousands of dead people as incidental to, I don't know how many resistance fighters Israel is claiming to have killed, 5,000, 10,000, I don't know. In another world, maybe 10 years from now, this will never be accepted. This will be deemed illegal. So international legal meaning is bound to change, and we have a say.
That was Abdelghany Sayed, an Egyptian expert on international law who teaches it at Kent University in London. Abdelghany once worked at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, the same court which sent out arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and a number of Hamas leaders, including Yahya Sinwar. We'll be getting back to Abdelghany and his insights about the way in which international law works when it comes to the Palestinian issue. But first, a reminder. If you enjoy listening to Kalam podcast, please rate the show and subscribe to it in whatever podcast application you're listening to right now. It helps other people find out about us. And for continuous updates about the podcast and the Middle East, follow us on Instagram at Kalam Podcast. And if you want to support independent journalism on Palestine and the Middle East, you can do so by joining Club Kalam on Patreon. For just $3 a month, you'll gain access to full-length interviews with all our guests, as well as lots of bonus content. So head over to patreon.com/Kalam podcast and sign up. That's patreon.com/Kalam podcast. Now, on to the show.
I can also confirm today that I have reasonable grounds to believe, on the basis of evidence collected and examined by my office, that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant bear criminal responsibility for the following international crimes committed on the territory of the State of Palestine from at least the 8th of October 2023. The crimes include starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, willfully causing great suffering, serious injury to body or health or cruel treatment, willful killing or murder, and intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population, as well as crimes against humanity of extermination and or murder, persecution, and allegations of crimes of committing other inhumane acts. My office submits that these individuals, through a common plan, have systematically deprived the civilian population of Gaza of objects indispensable to human survival.
This is the voice of the Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan at the International Criminal Court at The Hague, as he announced the arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, as well as Yahya Sinwar and other Hamas leaders. This came shortly after the International Court of Justice at The Hague said it could not rule out genocide in Gaza and said it would investigate South Africa's accusation. And just last week, the same court definitively announced that the Israeli settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank are illegal, turning the 800,000 Israeli settlers on the West Bank into international criminals. These are enormous developments when it comes to the Palestinian issue, but I personally often find myself confused and feeling slightly ignorant, to be honest, when it comes to the technicality of international law. Well, lucky enough for me and for whoever's listening and has the same experience, we have Abdelghany Sayed with us today. He's an expert on international law and has literally worked at the prosecutor's office at the ICC. We spoke in May of this year, so some of the subject matter may be slightly dated. Keep that in mind. Now, without further ado, here's Abdelghany Sayed.
So I don't really write on why we need to prosecute Islamic State perpetrators, but I'm more interested in why we need to prosecute Iraqi state and Syrian state and American and UK state perpetrators in Iraq and Syria, for instance. I write a lot on Palestine and on Egypt also, but my writing on Palestine as well as Egypt is really not motivated by the idea that I want to be the Palestinian person. I'm extremely against particularizing Palestine so much. I write on Palestine just as an example, just as yet another stark and easy, very easy example on how international law and the modern global system subjugates the peoples of the global south. But Palestine is no different to Egypt, Colombia, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka. There isn't much difference. The difference is not qualitative, is rather quantitative. Maybe the violence in Palestine is on a larger scale, on a more widespread, more widespread, more intense, but it's not qualitatively different. My main angle is Global South, accordingly.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that despite kind of very anti-Palestinian voices saying that this is a very complicated issue, I think that what particularizes Palestine is simply its intensity, I guess, and how clear cut it is, how obvious the injustices are. Whereas in other conflicts, it's a bit more difficult to grasp. But when it comes to Egypt's role in all of this, could you explain to us, just first of all, what does it mean for Egypt to join the ICJ case? What does that mean practically?
Well, practically, what it means is that, in the ICJ case, there are two parties, a party, a claimant, and a defendant. Parties joining may only be claiming, could only be on the claimant side. You had Germany saying that they will intervene on the Israeli side at some point. Of course, this is ridiculous manipulation of international legal discourse. There's nothing called intervening on the defendant's side. You can intervene on the claimant's side for obvious reasons. If I'm claiming against you, you're the only defendant. No one, if someone likes you and wants to be in solidarity with you, good for them, but they will not be a defendant. But as a claimant, many others can be claimants like me, not only me. Especially at the international level, that states have obligations to intervene in situations like Palestine. They do have obligations to intervene in a situation, in a humanitarian catastrophe, etc., as a state. So any state can be a claimant and can join the ICC case. What it means that Egypt is joining the ICC case is, on the one hand, symbolic. The idea that many nation states will be joining, it does have a symbolic weight. On the other hand, on the legal aspect itself, it does not really make things different. Maybe Egypt can offer South Africa a new perspective. Can offer the case now, because not only offer South Africa, because Egypt now is another claimant. maybe Egypt can offer a new perspective. But I highly doubt it. The main idea is that basically Egypt it's a symbolic move. It's a symbolic step. Perhaps the only legal weight of it is that Egypt, whether it liked it or not, was brought up in the case. So now Egypt is no longer a party that does not exist and that cannot speak. So Egypt was mentioned in the Israeli defense at the International Court of Justice. And at that point, Egypt did not respond after after a week or so, where President Sisi spoke to people and just made a hint, something like that, responding to the Israeli claim that it is Egypt that is hindering humanitarian assistance. Today, Egypt can speak for itself. So this is the only legal bearing. It's good, actually. I think it's really positive, especially when it comes to the administration of the Rafah border crossing and the crime of starvation. The tactic of starvation as a crime or a tactic within the crime of genocide. Because, genocide, the crime of all crimes, it's the crime that has so many other crimes, including starvation.
So you mentioned it's a symbolic move by Egypt. And I wanted to ask you how much maneuvering space does Egypt actually have when it comes to its relationship with Israel? Considering, it's like the Camp David Accords is such a foundational aspect of the Egyptian state, or at least its foreign policy, and its relationship to the U.S. and all of the military aid it receives every year. So how big of a move is this, and how much further can it go without risking everything?
How big of a move it is? I don't think it's. It is big, but it should not really bother the Israelis so much, because after all, it's a legal move, and it's a move within the parameters of the modern legal system. So there is no big. Nothing is happening on the ground. And also Egypt historically, despite Camp David, Egypt historically, since the talks with the Israelis in 1977, has never abandoned or has never claimed that it will no longer be using the mainstream modern international legal system towards realizing Palestinian rights. Even during Mubarak, who is perceived in public discourse, especially post-2011 and during the revolution, as Israel's best friend, etc., etc. This is the matter is absolutely and extremely way more complicated than this. The way the Palestinian case was administered under Mubarak is way more complex. Amr Moussa, the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, did a lot of work. All of it was legal. Some of it was not just mainstream law, but actually critical law even. Egypt, the discourse it spoke at the Security Council, at the diplomatic forums throughout the 80s and 90s, in many ways was a third worldist discourse that does not just adopt any mainstream legal interpretation of legal principles, but a kind of progressive, but by progressive, I have to put it in inverted commas, because we're talking about 50s and 60s progressive. We're talking about the post-colonial state, the new states entering the world, and they are the speakers, the political organizations that speak on behalf of the peoples of the global South. So Egypt was never promised to abandon international law, and was never the friend of Israel when it comes to international law on Palestine. People still think that Egypt was Israel's best friend because people don't think international is enough. So yes, of course, Egypt was doing a lot in terms of international legal movements and steps in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. But people don't take that seriously because people don't think that speaking at the Security Council is really a meaningful step. And they might be right. But Egypt, for example, played a central role in many Security Council resolutions against Israel, and even in the Security Council resolution about the illegality of settlements 2017, it played two roles. It actually played a central role in the resolution, which was a very important resolution. I think it was in January 2017, but at the same time, it played this role in coordination with Israel, etc., etc. So how big of a movement is what Egypt did? I don't think it's that big, but yes, of course, it's significant. It's the first time Egypt goes to a court, because we're not talking about a council. That's not a council in Geneva. So Egypt has historically been outspoken in Geneva, but Geneva mechanisms are weak mechanisms. Less outspoken in New York, and the mechanisms in the US are more powerful. You have Security Council, that's a more powerful platform than Human Rights Council in Geneva. So Egypt has been also outspoken there, less outspoken. But before an international tribunal, this is definitely the first time Egypt does something in a case, because again, this is not an advisory opinion. So Egypt did intervene in the advisory opinion case proceedings today, like this year. There is advisory opinion proceedings before the International Court of Justice, but also in 2004, I think, which was the advisory opinion on the consequences of the construction of the wall. Egypt did intervene in these. So yeah, it's new, but it's not that big.
Right. Okay. That's really helpful. I think a lot of people I think most people don't follow, like Security Council resolutions and international law to like in minute detail, and are not really aware probably of all of the things that the Mubarak regime and Amr Moussa did in this international law setting, and I think that there's like a growing apathy when it comes to international law, because young people supporting Palestine just, I think, are kind of disillusioned because they don't see any movement, they don't see any concrete results. Israel is just kind of not unstoppable, no matter what international law says. What would you say to that kind of like young frustration around this? Like, does it, like, because I think a lot of people are at this point are like, who cares? It doesn't matter.
I don't take this frustration negatively. I think it's good. I only take it negatively when it's negative frustration directed towards not doing anything. But as long as it's frustration directed towards more movement and more anger, I don't take it negatively, even when this anger is translated into, for instance, criticizing what I said. Because, for instance, when the International Court of Justice orders provisional measures order, this movement would be like, no, this is not enough, this is late, this is inadequate, this court is a tool in the hands of colonialism and imperialism, etc. This is not what I would say. I would rather write a 3,000-word article in order to show what is positive and what is negative. But this is what I would say. I do see, for example, the International Court of Justice's provisional measures order. I do see a lot of positive things in it. But I also view it negatively in many ways. And after all, I'm happy with the frustration, because after all, what people feel is what it is. Meaning that the fact that there is a big gap between the legal community and the street is not something that we should take lightly. I'm not one of the lawyers, and that's why I like to refer to myself as a repentant lawyer. So I'm not one of the lawyers who would discredit your argument because you don't know that Article 23, paragraph 1, subparagraph B says this and this and that. I would never do that. And I think that anger that cannot be addressed in legal language is my problem as a lawyer and is my problem as law. It's the problem of law. So I don't take this frustration negatively. The ICC prosecutor's application for arrest warrants did generate a lot of anger. How he adopted a both sidesist approach.
Sure.
Of course, anger on both sides. Like the US thinks you cannot say both sides, but also and Germany, but also the Palestine Solidarity Movement thinks that you cannot use this both sidism in relation to Israel and Palestine, to Israeli and Palestinian leaders. To me, so I'm a former staff of the ICC prosecution. I worked on this. I know the standards of case selection and prioritization and all the paragraphs and subparagraphs of the articles. And I understand the anger on the Palestinian side, of course. On the German and the US side, it's opportunistic, realpolitik anger. I don't take it seriously. But on the pro-Palestine movement, I understand the anger. And actually, as a professional, I can tell you the technicalities that justify this anger. Actually, as a matter of fact, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court did disregard all the standards and policies and practice of the Office of Prosecutor in order to stick to the imperatives of Western politics that Israel-Palestine conflict, this both sidist approach approach to Israel and Palestine as a conflict, not as a struggle on against foreign domination. So this anger, I like it. It's not that I dislike it. Even if it insults me, I don't mind that. And similarly for the International Court of Justice, I did see a lot of positive things, but of course I respect that anger and that frustration. And I think it is the right thing, meaning that it is not good to tell international legal institutions that, that's really good, we like that, we are satisfied. Because international legal institutions are the product of continuing colonial realities. So they will never actually achieve what is satisfying. The Global South movement and the Palestine movement will always be unsatisfied, rightly so.
So let's talk a little bit about the ICC and the both sides isms. So arrest warrants have been issued for 2 Israeli leaders and 3 Hamas leaders. Why? We understand the frustration coming from just like equating what the Israelis are doing and what Hamas did or are doing. But from a technical point of view, why is this incorrect? You mentioned that it was sort of like they bypassed certain technical methodologies.
Well, I mean, the Office of the Prosecutor, since the very beginning of its operation in 2002, since Luis Moreno Ocampo, the first prosecutor, has been very much keen on ensuring that it will not investigate all crimes under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, under the jurisdiction of the court. Why? Because this will be too much. We don't have the money or the staff. We are not prepared for that. So we will basically adopt a focused approach whereby we will focus on the most serious crimes. This is a comparative statement. And focus on the most responsible officials. So, for example, in Sudan, you have the Minister of Defense and an army officer and low rank and a mid-rank army officer. All of these people committed crimes. But no, instead of trying to go after these 6 perpetrators, we'd rather just make one case against the president, for instance, because he's the most responsible, or maybe the Minister of Defense. So we will not seek to take all these colonels, the 6 colonels, for example, in Darfur, who ordered killings. No, we will take the man who ordered the 6, so he's the most responsible, and we will only take the most serious crimes. This is as early as 2003, really, in a policy paper that Moreno Campo released in 2003.
Right.
And basically, by most theorists, the notion is called gravity. This is a term of art under the Rome Statute. So we will only prosecute the gravest crimes. And basically, within each case, we will follow what we call a sequenced approach. So if there are two groups fighting each other, such as in northern Uganda, you have state crime and you have non-state actor crime. So we will follow a sequenced approach whereby we will compare the gravity of both sides and prosecute the graver perpetrator and take only one or two or like a small number of perpetrators from that side, a symbolic number, basically. So that's what the ICC prosecution has always promised. Our work is symbolic. That's what it is. Right. So in northern Uganda, for example, the prosecutor said, we are not going to prosecute state forces. We're going to prosecute only non-state armed group because their crimes are graver, are of more gravity. It's sequenced because the office promises to come back later to state forces. So these are the standards. Of course, I mean, the practice in relation to this standard is extremely inconsistent and erratic. So, for example, in Kenya, in the investigation in Kenya, the office decided to abandon the sequenced approach and just prosecuted both sides from the beginning. Why? We don't know. For political reasons, really. In Uganda, Libya, and Afghanistan, the office followed a sequenced approach, but there is a pattern. In Uganda, the office followed a sequenced approach to prosecute first the non-state actor. In Libya, to prosecute first the uncivilized Gaddafi government people. In Afghanistan, to prosecute Taliban crime. What is deprioritized is a constant. It's state crime. And then I would add, in Libya and Afghanistan, it's the crime of the modern, liberal, Western democratic state. What the office did in relation to the application for arrest warrants on Palestine and Israel, on Palestinian and Israeli leaders, is that basically it simply abandoned every single policy standard it had set. The sequenced approach all of a sudden was deemed irrelevant, and the gravity notion, so the office should assess the gravity of each side, etc., it was abandoned. So if the office would like to assess the gravity of Israeli conduct, we're not talking about since 7 October, we're talking about since 13 June 2014. If the office would like to assess the gravity of the Israeli conduct and the gravity of the Palestinian conduct since 13 June of 2014, I have no idea how it is defensible that the office would proceed not according to a sequenced approach, but against both sides. The gravity assessment is assessed according to specific factors related to the crimes committed. These are 5 factors. I would refrain from mentioning them just for time. But each of the factors refer to a significantly, incomparably higher gravity of the Israeli conduct. It is incomprehensible how any comparison would lead to a both sides strategy to prosecution. What the office did was purely political. The office starts with the Palestinian side for no apparent reason. So if you listen to his statement, it's as if, that any speaker today, even Bernie Sanders, etc., whenever they start talking, they have to say, of course I condemn Hamas, blah, 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 but, So this is fine for Bernie Sanders, this is fine for, whoever speaker, but it's incredible that the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is following a similar tactic, starting with the Palestinian side. Why? And then moving to the Israeli side, his statement does not mention the term occupation, which is a legal term. It must be mentioned. He doesn't mention it. In the part on Palestinian conduct, he mentions he mentions Israeli victims and survivors and their pain and suffering. He mentions it 3 times. On the part on the conduct of Israeli forces, the term victim in relation to Palestinian appears nowhere, because Palestinian victims are expected to be victims. That's fine. And then there are other, he accuses the Israeli side of 7 counts of crime, killing and extermination, starvation, etc. But the Palestinian side is accused of many things, including torture and rape on the 7th of October. How on earth can torture and rape on the 7th of October be compared to torture very well documented, uncontested, independently verified, torture and use of sexual violence, not on the 7th of October, since 2014 and ongoing, because also, so here's another standard that the office should assess in relation to prioritizing cases, which is the impact of the office's work on ongoing criminality, namely how a potential intervention by the office will impact ongoing criminality, as in putting an end to it. The crimes committed by Palestinian armed groups are, as a matter of fact, not ongoing. The Israeli side's conduct is not only ongoing, Israeli side is able, willing, and actually doing, has been doing, will be doing this and this and that. So if you look at ongoing criminality, how are you proceeding against both sides? And the final point is that I really think Palestinian leaders should actually submit themselves to the Hague, because I really don't think the prosecutor would be able to sustain his claims, and the appearance of leaders from Hamas in the Hague will not lead to a successful conviction, and this case will be dropped. Because really the counts that the prosecutor mentions, to me, they're presented for a political audience, not for a legal audience. I mean, some of them will be sustained, but for example, rape and torture, no, even if they happened, because we're not talking about whether this happened or not. We're talking about whether this happened as a part of a plan or policy. And the office will not be able to prove that.
Yeah. So I've taken up enough of your time, but I want to ask a last question about you've just displayed how the international court system at The Hague is permeated with, or is kind of the politics of the kind of like political ideology of the West, of the Western liberalism and the like post-World War II order permeates the international court system at The Hague. Clearly, when you start with the kind of, the Bernie Sanders comparison, where you kind of just leave legal methodology to the side in order to make a political point that you cannot attack Israel without also saying that Hamas is really bad. Just as like a last point, should we still put our faith into these institutions? And why should we put our faith into these institutions? To anyone who is like highly doubting this route being successful to affect change in Israel and like bring justice to Palestinians.
There's a very large body of literature, amazing writings by third world approaches to international law scholars. TWAIL, that's the acronym. One impressive book is by Anthony Angie, and I can't remember the title, but it's something like Imperialism and the Making of International Law, something like that. And it is not true that international law is simply political, and it is not true that international law is simply the making of the West. And it is not even true that the West is the making of the West. I mean, culturally. What is known as the West is also the making of the interaction between Western peoples and forces mainly, and Arabs and Africans and Asians and others. and Latin Americans, of course. So international law, it has facilitated colonialism. More than that, it's not only that it has facilitated colonialism, but it is itself the making of the necessities of colonialism, meaning that what we know today as the principle of sovereignty, that's Anthony Angie in his book, that's why he says that what we know today as the principle of sovereignty is not simply a principle that facilitated colonialism, but no, it's a principle that was created and shaped by the necessities of colonialism, meaning that the principle itself did not mean something rigid. It kept growing and developing and evolving in view of what was necessary, of what colonialism required. Similarly, again, I do not think that when the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court does what he did with Palestine, it's not simply that he went against the policy and standard and practice in relation to case selection and prioritization. The policy and standards and practice on case selection and prioritization are themselves the product. They themselves were shaped by the office's consistent endeavors to avoid prosecuting state perpetrators and liberal perpetrators, and to focus the work of the court on terrorists and uncivilized actors. So what we know today as the policy and standards on prioritization in cases and selection, prioritization and selection of cases, is itself the product of some kind of a colonial practice. But at the same time, it is not true that the colonial subject was always at the receiving end, never acting. This is absolutely true, especially of the interwar period, the mandate system period, and the period that followed World War II up until the 70s, where the colonized, formerly colonized, and new states played a massive role in the formulation of what is known today as international law. For instance, Additional Protocol 1 and Additional Protocol 2 to the Geneva Conventions. Of course, the US played a big role in them. Of course, they are bound by what preceded them. But they have a lot of wins that were presented not by the US and not by England, but by Egypt, by India, by Indonesia, even the European nations that know what it is to be under the risk of occupation, such as Belgium, Switzerland, the weak countries. Belgium delegates in the Geneva Convention talks and the Additional Protocol talks. They don't really talk like imperial powers, but it's a small nation that is always under the risk of occupation. So you see a lot of the concerns of the third world pronounced by, for instance, Belgian delegates. So it is not true that international law is just simply a tool for domination. International law also is a tool for emancipation, and it is too lazy to say international is a tool for domination and I will abandon it until it becomes a tool for emancipation. International law will never, or anything else in life, not only international law, will never be one thing. There will always be a continuing struggle. And that's why I say it's lazy, because this tendency to dismiss or accept something is basically to say, this is good and let's sit until the good system does its good stuff. No, there will always be changes and there will always be struggles over the meaning of international law. International legal language itself does not mean much. It means a lot of things, of course, but after all, there's a context that interprets the international legal rule. For instance, international humanitarian law says civilians are protected in armed conflict. But there is the principle of proportionality, which means that you can attack if there are civilians who will be killed, in case your target is a military target, and in case civilian loss is proportionate, that's proportionality, to the military advantage sought, the military advantage that you're seeking. in the world where we live, in the global war on terror era where we live, the principle of proportionality is used to portray any civilian loss as proportionate, as incidental, as collateral damage. These are all synonymous. In another world where the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, for example, is more powerful, civilian protection in interpretation will have more weight. So there will always be, today in the moment where we live, where you have liberal leaders or not so liberal in Western countries, and their potential replacement would be people like Trump and Milei and these crazy leaders. In this very extremely difficult moment where we live, it is possible to interpret under international law tens of thousands of dead people as incidental to, I don't know how many resistance fighters Israel is claiming to have killed, 5,000, 10,000, I don't know. In another world, maybe 10 years from now, this will never be accepted. This will be deemed illegal. So international legal meaning is bound to change, and we have a say. And what the International Court of Justice did, which is not nothing, and what Karim Khan did, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, which is really not nothing. I'm very critical of it, but it's positive, it's big. This only happened because of the frustration and the anger of the Palestinian Solidarity Movement.
That was extremely helpful. Thank you so much, Abdelghany Sayed, for sharing your insights and your deep knowledge of all of these issues. I think that our listeners are gonna be extremely. It's gonna be a really useful tool moving forward to try to think about these things. So thank you so much for joining us at Kalam Podcast.
Thank you, Edgar. Thank you very much.
That was Abdelghany Sayed and the 20th episode of Kalam Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, if you like the show, please give it a rating and subscribe to it on whatever podcast platform you're listening to right now. It helps other people find out about us. And on that note, that's all from us this week. Peace. Kalam was written and hosted by me, Edgar Mannheimer. Research and production by Sam Karl Samra. Poetry reading in Arabic by Khulud Saghir, and sound design by Arthur Mannheimer.